Join me as we begin this series of interviews and start to ask the questions that will be explored by different people over the coming episodes of this podcast. Today's guest, the very first interview, is Melinda, who is from a semi-rural town in the Yarra Valley, which is on the border of regional Victoria. She worked as a holistic funeral director throughout this COVID year of 2020. We talk about role reversals during lockdown with her long-term partner, who managed their large family from home, while he worked remotely as a team leader. And Melinda was on the front line, navigating grief and supporting people who had lost loved ones amidst statewide restrictions. You can witness me fumbling my way through this very first interview with a guest that displays beautifully her obvious grace, sensitivity and thoughtfulness. I hope you enjoy it. Well, I'd like to welcome you, Melinda, to this very first episode of Lockdown, Stories from Inside. And thank you so much for being my very first interviewee on this podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. It's an honour to be here.
I just want to start by painting a bit of a picture, an oral picture of the town or the suburb in Victoria that you call home. So can you tell us a little bit about your neighbourhood and where it's located in relationship to the city of Melbourne?
Sure. So I live in a little town called Yarra Junction, which is in the upper Yarra Valley out towards Warburton. It's a small town. It's just got a few shops in it. It's quite remote. It's about 70 k's from Melbourne Central.
So if you were going to drive out from the city of Melbourne, does it take about an hour and a half, would you say? Or
yeah, depending on the traffic.
Yeah.
It's probably about, into the centre of Melbourne, it's closer to an hour and a half.
What would you say the culture of your neighbourhood is? Would you say there was a lot of a variety of cultures there, or fairly generic? Is there a sort of a dominant either religious or cultural feel to your neighbourhood?
I would say that it would be a very white, lower socioeconomic community. There's a lot of families here that have lived here multi-generationally, part of the old rural farming community. And then there's a whole other newer emerging community of more environmentally orientated, more spiritually inclined people that are moving out into the community. There's city people that are wanting that green change and wanting to be closer to nature as well.
So yes, talking about the political inclinations of your region, for overseas listeners that may not know our political system in Australia, we have the Liberal Party, who are sort of synonymous really with the more business, white-collar, economic perspectives and approaches. We've got the Labor Party, which is another major party, who are traditionally representing the working class. It's not so black and white these days, but that's where they've come from. And we've got the Greens, who are more of an environmentally based and socially based political party. And of course, lots of independents too. So what do you think the main political inclinations are of your town and your sort of region?
I would guess as an overall, as a reflection of the wider community, it would be more Labor orientated. I think there's a lot more working class people here. I think a lot of people that work in trade. But I also think I don't think they're the large majority, but there's a significant number of Greens orientated voters here as well, because of the large stretches of native forest that are still here, and a lot of people are quite passionate about protecting what's left.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful part of the world, the Yarra Valley. It's quite a large tourist destination too. It's got a lot of wineries, doesn't it? And those beautiful farmlands, lots of berry picking and all of that bush. So it's a really nice place. You talked a little bit about the socioeconomic status. This is a question that I'm going to be asking all of the interviewees on this program. Why I'm asking this, as it is the first interview, I feel like I should probably explain this. I'm trying to get a feel for any correlation between the way people experienced the restrictions placed upon them during the 2020 lockdown of Victoria, and in particular, that real isolation that people may have felt during this time in our community, and if there's a correlation between economic circumstances and these big social restrictions and the way people experience them. So you were just mentioning that the socioeconomic status that you think your neighbourhood would probably fall into is quite a low income, a low socioeconomic demographic. Is that right?
I would say the wider community, yes.
Do you feel like your household falls into this same category, Melinda?
No, we both work full-time, my partner and I, and we're definitely much higher income than the average person here.
Yeah, it really does make a difference, that double income too, doesn't it? Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's a very personal question. I do think it has great relevance, though, particularly for this exploration. So I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about your living arrangements. How many people do you live with, and what relationship are they to you?
I live with my partner of 23 years and my son, who's just turned 21. I have a second son who's 17, and I have two daughters who are 14 and 10. We also have a number of animals. So we have a dog and two cats and some chickens. And my oldest son's girlfriend comes and lives here couple of days a week, usually.
Oh, it's a full house.
A full house.
Yeah. Describing your place of residence, so you're obviously living in a fairly spacious home. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your home is sort of like, how much room you have, what's the backyard like, and how much land you're sort of occupying there?
Yeah. So we live in a 5-bedroom house. So it's a big home. We very purposely purchased this home because we are a big family, and I guess we had the capacity to buy something of this size to make that comfortable for all of us, especially with growing older children. And we live on a small acreage. We live on just over an acre, so we have a lot of space. We don't see our neighbours from our home. That has felt significant during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sounds like a pretty lovely way to live. What was a typical day in the week for you guys as a family before Victoria went into lockdown?
So during the working week, Dan and I would get up and get ready to go to work. He worked in Collins Street. He's an engineer. He worked in a very tall building in the middle of the city, and spent the majority of his working hours there at a desk away from home. So his day involves 3 hours of travel, minimum, 3 or 4 hours of travel. And my working day was largely broken up between being at my desk at home and being at my desk in the outer, sort of, I guess they're the inner northeastern suburbs of Melbourne. So we probably through this time, I think you're about to ask me this question about how it might have changed. Yeah, I think I wanted to add there, though, that we were obviously in the mornings preparing our 4 children to go to school and university.
Yes.
And that certainly allowed us space to be able to go and do our work during the day.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, we'll go into the next category. There's about 5 different categories, just to kind of flag this for new listeners, given the fact that this is the first interview of this program. I've got five sort of categories that we're going to be talking about over the course of these episodes. The first is the living arrangements and sort of whereabouts people live, which you've just answered for us. The next section is about work life for yourself, and a little bit about what you do for a living. There's a category on relationships, how they have fared through this time. And there's also a section for people with children who had to juggle the schooling. The last section we'll talk about is mental health, so how an individual's mental health fared during the lockdowns and the social isolation and the restrictions. Moving into the work life space, what do you do? What's your occupation, Melinda?
I'm a holistic funeral director. I work for a specialist funeral company that provides environmentally sustainable funeral care to people in Melbourne and Greater Victoria. I particularly do a lot of specialist work in the paediatric space, caring for babies and children, but I do work across the life spectrum with older people as well.
Wow. What did a typical workday look like for you during the lockdown that Victoria went through? Did things change much for you in your line of work or not?
Yeah, definitely they did. I think the main differences were obviously there's extraordinary restriction on travel. So obviously I was one of the permitted workers, so I had to carry a travel permit with me all the time. I had to document all my movements every day, which did feel quite tedious to be having to constantly be thinking about where I was going and writing all those things down. And all of the families that I cared for, every movement that they made around Melbourne to be able to come and spend time with the person that had died or to attend funeral-related gatherings all had to be contact traced. So my work days particularly felt a lot more complicated because in order to meet all those code regulations that were imposed on my industry and many others, there was a huge amount of extra administration and paperwork involved to be able to facilitate just the care that we were providing.
Absolutely. For those people who may not be aware, we had a lot of checkpoints in Victoria at this time. We still do actually, around, because we had a 5-kilometre radius that we were not allowed to travel outside of, unless, as Melinda has outlined, you had a work permit, which was basically a document that you carried around either on your phone or as a piece of paper, that if you went through a checkpoint, if you were stopped by a member of the law, you could show that to say that you were allowed to go to work and you're allowed to travel outside of that 5K radius. Huge effect on people's mentality. It was a thing that we had never seen anything like this. It felt quite Orwellian for many of us. And again, just having that permission, having to ask that permission to actually just go about your daily lives and do what it is that you do to earn a living and to provide care for people, in your case, Melinda. I think it had a huge impact on our society. Did you find there's also another part of the social restrictions and the rules, I suppose, that was a difficult one for people to manage and still is? The mandatory face mask wearing, when that directive came in, how did that affect your ability to do your job and to be in the space with people grieving and in an environment which really does require a lot of communication on various levels?
Yeah, so when the masks came about and the mandatory mask wearing came about, it was a very significant shift. I think particularly because I feel in the more empathetic, caring space, our facial expressions are such an important way of an indication of the way that we communicate, and also perhaps the way that we read the emotional well-being of each other. So for me, that was a very painful shift.
Absolutely.
The physicality, I guess, initially wearing the mask, it took me a while to get used to it. I certainly had to really learn how to breathe in a way that was calm and regulated, because just naturally, I think that would probably have been common for everybody, most people. I do wear masks in my work as PPE anyway in certain spaces, but certainly not for the length of time that we're expected. I think the thing that was really difficult for me was when the masks became mandatory, it meant that every funeral gathering and funeral space meant that everybody in the space was masked. So we were doing a lot of film and live stream, and that meant that the visual memory of those people was not only a very tragic, sad event, but that everybody's faces were covered, crying and grieving with a face mask on is incredibly distressing.
Absolutely.
And there were times where I saw families, just through physical necessity, have to take their mask off because it was too distressing and actually really impeding their ability to breathe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can totally imagine. Talking about funerals, again, something that some people may not be aware of, we have had restrictions on the amount of people allowed at funerals and weddings, etc. I mean, I think weddings were actually completely off the rule book at one stage anyway, but funeral, talk to us about some of the rules around funerals.
Absolutely. So the rules at the high point of the restrictions, the rules were that we were allowed to have 10 mourners. So they were 10 guests attending the funeral, including the family. And at the early stage, that also included babies. So very, very small infants were included in that 10, which made that particularly felt very difficult because there were families that had to make some very difficult decisions around little ones that were dependent on being in arms with their mothers and fathers, whether or not they could occupy a space, even as a close family member. And then in addition to the 10, we were allowed to have necessary funeral staff. So the funeral company deemed who that was. In terms of our staff, a celebrant or a priest or a minister, and then anybody else that was required to run the service.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think we can't quite comprehend, if you haven't been through that, how significant that would feel for people, not being able to invite whoever had known and loved that person has passed into that grief space and to see them off. So incredible insights. Thank you. So I'm going to move into the next section of our interview now, which is about relationships and the impact of lockdown on relationships. You've mentioned that you've been in a relationship for, was it 22 years or 23 years? 23 years. You live together. You've lived together for a long time. You've had 4 children together. Did you find that lockdown brought you closer together or pushed you further apart?
I think that generally, it sounds strange because you can hear the amount of pressure that I was under personally in my work, but I think in many ways we probably just stayed the same for us. I think we personally had our own challenges, but perhaps it's just part of the way that we relate. I felt that because we lived together and we have for such a long time, that I think just we were very fortunate that I think at the end of the day, so I think we're probably quite exhausted. So we probably didn't have the energy to really be engaging in extended amounts of conflict. But we also just, I think we just managed to just keep going together.
Sure. It sounds like you're also out of the home mostly every day, if not, I don't know how many days a week. Maybe you could answer that question. How many days a week would you have been out of the home for?
Yeah, that's a good question, Amanda, and I think that is part of how it was for us. That Dan, he became the full-time parent in the home and worked full-time from the beginning of March and has continued. So he moved into the full-time care, juggling full-time work with our children. And I was really out of the home most days, at least 4 to 5 days a week.
Yeah, a real role reversal. How did your partner find that change of scenery for him? How do you think, from your observations and discussions, that he found switching it over, working from home and being around the the home life and also around the kids more?
Yeah, I think that initially it was a big challenge. My teenage sons were quite amused watching the role change, and certainly as part of being the full-time parent in the home, things like having to learn for the first time ever really in an adult working life around the rhythms that are required in a home, keeping on top of washing and cooking and all of those things. I think that was probably a positive in our relationship and perhaps reflects part of why we had a more positive experience than others might reflect.
Sure.
But he certainly, I think, it was a challenge juggling being on a Zoom call for large. He was doing conferencing for a large part of the day, and we had to get up and print all the children's schoolwork before we both went off to work and set them up on all of their devices and things.
Wow.
So I think initially it was really challenging, and then we were very fortunate our adult son was able to be part of holding the fort and being another adult in the home, and that was incredibly helpful.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. That's really amazing. So basically what I'm hearing from you just in this section of the interview about relationships is that I guess because you were so flat out and busy and out of the home and really focused on your work life, and there was a role reversal where your husband or your partner, came home or was more in the home, and kind of challenged and inspired to really embrace that role as well as juggling his own work. It felt like it was just a different shift for you guys, and you you sort of fared fairly well, I guess, over this time as a relationship, as a couple. Would that be sort of accurate to reflect back?
Yeah, I think so. I think also a reflection on that was, as I said, that there was a third adult in the home, and I think that's a very significant. I felt very fortunate to have, a young person that had the willingness and the capacity to join the parenting efforts and to help run the household. I think that was an enormous help to both my partner and I. And I think that perhaps if that wasn't in place, that the pressure that we would have felt would have been more significant.
Oh, well, hats off to your oldest child there. My congratulations to him. That would have been an amazing experience for him too, and no doubt taught him a lot. Thank you for answering those questions around the relationships. We're going to move into the children and schooling section of the interview now. So you've mentioned you had 4 children, one of which is a university student and an adult in the home. The 3 others, what ages are they? What ages are they, and also what years are they in at school, Melinda?
So my second son is 17. He'll be 18 soon, in 6 weeks. And he is in year 11 at the local state high school. My daughter, who's 14, is at the local Steiner school in year 8. And my youngest daughter is 10. She'll be 11 soon. She's in year 5 at the Steiner school.
Okay, so the youngest is sort of in late primary school, and the oldest school-age child is almost finished their high school experience. So, but intense years, the last 2 years of high school, there's a lot of work. How much I know you've gone over this a little bit, but how much did you guys have to help facilitate that remote learning? And I know you've mentioned that it was really beneficial for you to have the oldest child who is an adult to really hold that space for them. Was it feasible for you guys to do so? Would you say that you had to really gear up your children to, present every day in that remote learning space? Or, tell us a little bit about what you observed there.
So the eldest is learning in an largely online-based platform anyway. So he, I think he took to it quite easily. There was a lot of structured engagement in his learning around morning check-in calls and things like that. So I felt from his perspective, even though he's a typical adolescent and, doesn't necessarily always want to be schooling, He did come to it with quite a level of acceptance, and just seemed to move through. I think the significant part for him is that he was also at a new school this year, so there's probably a little bit more. He was already on a steep learning curve of being in that transition, so his efforts to make sure he stayed on top of things were pretty good. And the school itself was keeping a much tighter eye on him in terms of tracking whether he was keeping up with things. So we didn't feel the need to be monitoring him as much.
Yeah.
My 14-year-old daughter, that was a bit of a different scenario. She is at the Steiner School. Their curriculum is not orientated towards an online platform at all, so it was a huge shift for that school to move learning into that realm. I think the children also aren't used to learning in that way. They're used to a very experiential-based classroom. It was quite challenging for her. I think we definitely had to encourage her every morning to get up and get out of bed, and I think that lack of structure of going somewhere, that was probably the more challenging part of. We still had to encourage them to get up and get dressed and prepare as though they were going to school. And I think for her, I think particularly that early adolescent time is quite tumultuous anyway in most households.
Absolutely, yeah.
So she was more resistant. But she did all the work. She did it, but we definitely need to keep a much tighter eye on her.
Yes, yeah, I can just imagine having that similar age group in my household. How about your grade 5 child? How did she go?
The little one? Yeah. So my little one is quite academically orientated and likes learning, and she's quite competitive as well. So she would have all her schoolwork done by lunchtime every day. So we would just prepare everything. She's quite unusual in that way, but she just zoomed through everything and was quite keen to get it all out of the way so she could have the rest of the day to read books.
Absolutely. And I think that whole morning session of schooling really suits the primary age kids particularly, doesn't it? So, that sounds really quite normal and quite ideal, doesn't it? Would you say that you've got any sort of concerns about how your children coped over that lockdown period in terms of, I guess, developmentally, educationally, socially? Was there any observations, I guess, that you had that you would like to share with us around how, I know you've got so many different age groups as well, so, maybe just a little bit about what your concerns or your observations were. Not always, maybe it's not concern, but some of the things that you've observed around how your children coped with the remote learning situation and lockdown in those times.
Well, the eldest at university, I think he really missed being on campus a lot. I think that's a very enjoyable part of tertiary education. He certainly, when he was finally able to a couple of weeks ago go back and do some practice-based learning, was very happy and definitely came home feeling lighter and more connected. It's a lot of time to sit on a computer.
Absolutely.
I know tertiary education requires a lot of that anyway, but just really I actually felt the reflection around the level of isolation more so when they went back into the school environment, and I saw the shift in their well-being and their emotional kind of experience. My children are all fairly introverted and quiet people, like we are generally, so they didn't reflect a lot of struggle during the lockdown, but I think it was more just a sense of there just seemed to be a bit of apathy going on around, will this ever end? This is so boring. And
yes.
I'd really just want to see my friends.
And just on that too, how did they meet their needs for social interaction over the time that they were at home in your community?
I think the eldest three have devices, so they were able to stay connected over different social media platforms and just general messaging and calls with their peers.
Yeah, it really did make a difference.
Yeah, the youngest one was very isolated. She spent a lot of time ringing my parents, so particularly the grandmothers. She would ring them nearly every day and talk to both our mothers for extended periods of time just to have a connection with somebody else that was outside the home.
Oh, how
Yeah,
beautiful.
it's quite sweet.
Yeah, that's actually quite, I mean, that is a positive as well as a bit of an indication of loneliness as well. But, there are pros and cons to all of this too. Were there any benefits or advantages that you saw in contrast to some of the experiences that are negative that you've outlined? What were some of the things that you have observed that are positive in this time?
Well, I think in our home, what was very positive was that everybody was in together. So even though there was a period of, there was a few teething problems getting into those routines. My partner Dan's actually he's quite a firm kind of, he works in management in his job, and so he just sort of took it like a management position and ran quite a tight ship. And I think in lots of ways our house, for having two working parents, our house in some ways ran more smoothly on a rhythmic kind of household routine level than it ever, because obviously, even though I was working, my focus when I would be here would be to keep those rhythms going that I always had as the mother in the household. But because they were all here, they had to be a lot more conscious of what they were doing. They were in each other's space a lot.
Yeah.
And they were keeping each other accountable for things like tidiness, and because they're all responsible for different domestic chores, they were able to communicate more clearly with each other of how they felt about that and what irritated them about certain things that people were doing.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that was nice. There was also a lot more gratitude for going outside, I felt. Yeah, and I think that was probably reflected in many different places in Melbourne.
That's right. Yeah, I was one of the positives that I witnessed personally was that once again we had kids on bikes outside riding around, riding around the neighbourhood, which we haven't seen for a long time because of the screen culture and the high level of extracurricular activities that people book in for their kids and all of this stuff that, they are great things to have in our lives, but the slowed pace allowed and the need for social interaction outside of school became so desired that that kids were really urged to go outside and exercise and get on their bikes or skateboards, and that really did hearten me when I saw that. Do you feel with your oldest son? How do you feel that age group, that early 20s, just coming into young adulthood and stepping out into the world, how do you think that COVID-19 and these huge social restrictions and social changes and rules have affected that age group category?
Yeah, so he's 21 and his girlfriend is 23, and they're both obviously, well, she's just finished her degree. He's got another 9 to 12 months left on his, and they're certainly reflecting to us a sense of concern around what the world that they're stepping out into. There's certainly questions around employment security, prospects, job prospects. I know that they are saying amongst their peers and in the tertiary space particularly, but also I guess for young people who have chosen different pathways, there's definitely a sense of a greater sense of questioning what it will all look like going forward from here.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the word apathy, which is such a common phrase used at the moment when we describe our young people, unfortunately. I think it was previously before COVID as well, but certainly big social changes and restrictions like a lockdown in our society have really pushed apathy into the foreground a lot more as a topic of concern. Looking around you in your community, your children certainly were touched by that, but are there any sort of other examples of high levels of anxiety, depression, aggression, apathy, anything like that you have witnessed throughout your community? Or do you think that the young people that have been through this year have been overly affected by it and pushed into those ways of feeling?
What I was thinking as you were asking that question, Amanda, was that a significant part of what's happened is that because we were locked down and we weren't able to engage with a lot of people, we weren't able to closely observe each other's lives as much as we would have, because I live in a community that mixes and spends a lot of time with each other. And so it was difficult to read how people were travelling, but certainly I know that there were parents that were really struggling to just get their children up every day, and certainly a lot of parents that had to let go of the schooling curriculum because it was the battle that was involved was so intense and so difficult that it was creating distress and upset that just was not worthwhile during the day. Yeah. I definitely saw around me, I think that the adult community actually seemed more impacted on the mental health level. For me, I think the holding of families and relationships and perhaps work, I think the pressures, probably the more responsibility people carried, the more intense the impact of it all felt.
Absolutely. And that just isn't a perfect little segue into my final section of the interview, actually, which is on mental health. We're going to bring it away from your children now and focus a little bit more on yourself, but also, yes, your observations of other adults in your life. Can you describe how you felt over the course of 2020, sort of at the beginning of the year when we were introduced to the idea of coronavirus and COVID-19, if you can remember that far back? It's been such a time warp this year. And then as more restrictions are placed on our daily lives, how that journey sort of went for you in a nutshell. I know it's a big question, but if you can just kind of cast your mind back to those initial feelings that you may have had when this new virus came into our being, our community, our world, and then as things kind of got tighter in terms of restrictions and the impact of this new virus, how did that play out for you personally?
Well, I think initially, and we all would have observed a similar experience. Our information about the virus was coming largely through media channels, and it was a fairly intense story that we were being given around the risk associated with the virus. And certainly my experience, and I think my experience was very coloured by my work, because of course immediately infection control became an extraordinary part of everything that I had to do in my work, and probably in many ways perhaps was more exaggerated in my life, because I felt a sense of responsibility in the early stages particularly. I had the whole way, but I felt a particular responsibility about being the person in the household that was going in and out of the home all the time into this potentially infectious space called the rest of the world, and then back into my home. So, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but in the initial stages, all members of my team, we would, as soon as we walked into our homes, we would completely strip, take all our clothes off and go straight into the shower. And all of the clothing and everything that we touched would all get washed every day. And that felt pretty intense, actually, to think, what am I carrying in? I had some people ask me, which was really interesting. They asked me how I felt about the potential of being the reason that my family might contract the virus and how I would feel if one of them died. I certainly psychologically felt the weight of going out into that dangerous, in inverted commas, that dangerous space and having no idea what I was bringing back home every day.
Right, yeah.
We, as a result of the work that I do, because I have a lot of contact with immunocompromised people, we made an agreement at the beginning of the process that if any of us developed any symptoms at all of illness, so even a runny nose or a slight cough, that we would have to be COVID tested
Sure.
in responsibility to what I might then take back out into the community. So I think that early stages were psychologically a lot more difficult for me. And as things progressed and we saw it all unfold in the community, I wouldn't say that I lessened my capacity or my vigilance around the management of it, but I would say that the greater impact on my mental health was just how much control and assessment I felt like I had to have constantly around everything I did. I've definitely felt the whole way that working professionally meant that my personal investment and belief system around everything that was happening had to come second, because I had a professional responsibility to upkeep those protocols that were in place. And something that we haven't mentioned yet was that there were significant fines in place for individuals, but my concern was more so on my workplace, that if I breached any of those regulations, then I will be leaving the owners of that business in a very compromising position. They were very large fines.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very sensitive area in which you're dealing with, so completely understandable. So what were some of the things that you did to cope with these feelings that you had initially or even throughout the whole year? Did you feel like you had to bring things in like some extra yoga practice or meditation, or what were some techniques? And I must say here that this actually does allow for people to be quite open with, some of the substances or some of the habits that people might have gotten into over this time. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that Victoria's alcohol consumption, for example, rose dramatically over the lockdown time. So was there anything that you can say or you feel to share that you did personally to really just cope with the heaviness of the situation and the stress involved in dealing with a potentially life-threatening virus?
Yeah, I guess there were a number of different ways that I managed it. The eating and drinking, certainly on the weekends when we got to the end of the week, every week I had a ritual where I would go to our local fromagerie and I would buy a selection of really beautiful cheeses, and then we would buy really good wine, and we just made those weekends really enjoyable. So, I think that my older children, I think all of my children actually really enjoyed the weekends in between, because we felt that we'd worked so hard through the week that it was like a reward on the weekends. And I just thought, well, we can't see anyone, we can't go anywhere to eat anywhere else. We're going to just eat really well here. Yeah. So we just really enjoyed food.
The earthly pleasures.
Yeah, and just really focusing, particularly I did, and I think it is part of my work practice as well, to make sure that my weekends were real downtime, that I probably did less. I think I probably was a lot less industrious, where I might have, engaged in projects and things and around the home and the garden and things. I actually just allowed myself to physically rest a lot more. I was much more mindful of how much sleep I was getting, because I could feel the pressure on me through the week was quite intense, and so I just needed to be really well rested. And I, from the beginning, made sure that we were all taking good supplements, and other things to support our immune system naturally, because I just really felt, and I still do, that was going to be, as it should be every year, regardless of what we're engaging with, that, having strong, healthy bodies was going to be the best way forward coming through that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's not forget that.
Yeah, and I think we probably just spent more time, which was probably a bonus, and a way of managing things as well. We spent more time together, talking to each other, and maybe spending more time on weekends. We definitely went outside and exercised a lot more together. That was probably, I'd have to say, a huge part of the well-being cycle in our home. There was a lot more. My partner and my eldest son started running and doing a lot of running, and our dog, I always have said through the whole thing that COVID, the dogs are the winners of COVID.
Yeah.
He got walked sometimes 4 or 5 times a day. So,
oh, wow. What a lucky dog.
He was pretty happy. Yeah, he was pretty happy. And everyone was here. So,
yeah, lots of attention.
Yeah, so that was definitely the way. And I think just spending time talking and connecting with good people in my life that were good listeners, and both sharing their experience and listening was really helpful.
I agree. Absolutely essential. Thank you for that. Were there things that, in the spirit of honesty, while we're on the topic, were there things that you did that were against the social restrictions at any time? I know that it's a tricky one to answer as a professional. Examples of this could include, going a little bit outside the 5K zone when you weren't working, perhaps, or visiting a friend when you really just felt like it was actually necessary to do so for whatever reason, or not wearing a face mask and having your own sort of quiet rebellion when you went walking. I know there's so many different accounts of this. Is there anything that you can think of that you did that you sort of felt that familiar sense that unfortunately we have become so aware of this year in Victoria of going against the law and being a little bit naughty?
Yeah, well, we were definitely, I guess we were very fortunate that out here, we have so much space. So when we would go out and exercise, we would be walking out in very open, wide spaces with really not anyone else around. So when we were not, in the vicinity of other people, we would take our masks, breathe some fresh country air.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic.
And, for me, to be honest, I have felt, and I feel even in this interview, I have probably had to behave myself a lot more through this time because of the professional impact. I felt, a significant, I'm not necessarily the most well-behaved person, but I did feel a lot of pressure to behave myself through this time because, of the fallout on my employer.
Absolutely. The impact's huge. You have to remember all of the ripple effect and, where it all goes. I agree. It's such an interesting, and there's so many layers to that. So thank you for.
I would say probably, though, what I did do is encourage other people to be, what they, for example, if I was in the company of someone that was really clearly very uncomfortable wearing their mask, even if I was wearing mine, I certainly brought a lot of compassion to what they needed to do to be able to be comfortable in the space that we were in. And, for me, I felt that there needed to be that middle ground process around just how much is too much for everybody on a personal level, in a professional setting. So, and I felt that as the time passed, I don't know if it was complacency or whether it was just more so people, there was more a sense of, perhaps we do the right thing most of the time, then those little moments, in the right space, under the right conditions. I also felt a sense of encouraging people to take responsibility for their own health, Amanda. I think, I could clearly observe if somebody was looking well or not. And I made a lot of my decisions around engagement, around, using common sense.
Thank you so much for being honest about that, Melinda. I really appreciate that. Was there a particular aspect of the restrictions that you found most difficult or most affected by? I know personally for myself, when the face mask directive came in, I had a huge reaction to that in myself. I'm an asthmatic. I was actually hospitalised this year for asthma. I had whooping cough for 3 months. And when I came out of hospital, the face mask, the mandatory face mask wearing was put in place. And for me, that one on so many levels did not feel right for me. And despite the fact that I could have gotten a medical exemption, I felt compelled to still wear that face mask because other people were so quick to feel the fear of the situation and not actually be comfortable in my presence if I wasn't. So I felt compelled to wear a face mask, and still do, because it is still a mandatory requirement, and for me in my workforce as well. But it was that was it for me. That was really my my biggest burden, I guess. Was there something that you could share that was really difficult for you?
Yeah, I think I think my work in many ways sort of is a daily reminder of really significant challenge. And so in many ways, probably I, as a default, seem to have a comparison a lot to what I was experiencing or seeing from the people that I was working with. And I think probably the most difficult experiences for me were actually work-related. I had a few families that I cared for that were in extraordinarily traumatic and tragic circumstances. And just recently, really one of the most painful experiences that I've had in my work, I had a situation where a gentleman had died suddenly, and one of his young adult sons was in Europe at the time and was able to get a flight back to Australia, but then had to go into 2-week quarantine in Sydney. And the experience of trying to support a young person in the face of sudden unexpected death, and not be able to, there was just no way of getting him here. I think, that was extraordinarily difficult and painful, and it really reflected for me, I think the reason that it pushed my buttons so much was because all my family are interstate. So I think if I reflect on what happened for me, what was most difficult for me was this, I guess, underlying concern that if any of my family members through that period of time were to become unwell or to die, that we would be locked out. The Victorians could not cross the border. Yeah. Our family could come in if they wanted to, but we were going to be locked out of any significant family event through the entire time. And at this stage, we're still heavily restricted, and I don't know when I'll see my elderly parents again.
Yes.
And that has been, I have to say, through my reflections of my work experiences, it was brought to home a number of times that the families that were suffering significant loss and tragedy through this time, I think that perhaps the pain and the long-term damage that was done to those particular families, I'm not sure how we come back from something like that. I feel that the flow-on effect of those traumatic events under the current circumstances will probably be studied and discussed for a very long time to come.
Indeed, yes. Just moving to the last few questions of this section, just a little bit of number scaling. On a scale of 1 to 10, could you rank your lowest state of mental health over the course of 2020, 1 being the lowest? And then again, what was your highest ranking during this time?
I think probably in consideration that I didn't feel locked down and I got to move around quite a lot, I think, I probably got into that kind of mid-range of, 4 to 5 on really difficult days. I don't think I ever kind of went above a 6 or 7 during the time.
So, quite a narrow.
Very mid-path. I think my peak moments were with my family and the people I love, but I wouldn't say that my general well-being was particularly high.
Yeah, I think I'm interested with people's response to this. And what are your observations on how the tight restrictions have affected those you know, in a nutshell? I know it's a really big question, but if you could sum it up in a couple of sentences or in a paragraph, what do you think these tight restrictions have meant for, and how do you think they've affected your community, the people that you know and love, the people that you call friends and your family?
I think my family are very fortunate to have been largely cushioned, as the interviews really reflected. We're in a very privileged, very cushioned space in many ways.
Yeah.
My observations looking outside in my community, there was definitely huge divided thought and feeling around the whole thing, around the, how everybody's level of engagement and sense of belief followed, the media story that we were given. There was definitely some significant conflict experienced within the community around that divided thought, and I certainly saw some really painful division in that way, because I think under pressure and under, I don't think anybody really thrives under being restricted in the sense that Victorians were. But I think everything that was sitting under the surface, anyone that was already vulnerable and struggling, that was all heavily exacerbated. And so I saw some very, very vulnerable members of my community through that time really struggle, and there's still ongoing concern in my community for the well-being of some individuals coming out the other side of that. Also concern around whether those divisions can be repaired, because it became a very political environment, both here in my community and in the wider community.
Yeah, there was a huge amount of tribalism. There was huge amounts of cultural warring, weaponized language, all of it. And I think, as you were saying, that's really been reflected far wider than the Victorian community. Have you got any observations or thoughts, concerns about Australia as a country, and even globally, about what the impact of COVID-19 has meant for us? Another huge question, I know, but if you've got any observations that you'd like to share with us, that would be great.
I think I feel that we're still, even though we're coming out of lockdown here in Victoria shortly, I just have this great sense that this is not over, and it won't be for a long time. And certainly the global situation feels quite different to the situation in Melbourne, and I have reflected somewhat on all the things that we've discussed through the interview around the impact on wellbeing and social welfare and all those sorts of things. And I do have a concern for humanity as to what impact this has had, what impact this will have long term, and how it might shape our attitudes and our sense of autonomy and empowerment going forward in all parts of our lives. I think I'd like to think that politically it's woken some people up around our responsibility around who we vote into power, or who through apathy we don't vote for and we allow to be voted into power. And I'd like to think that it perhaps might have, it might help to fortify perhaps a sense of more individual capacity for change on a smaller scale. Yeah. I think there's such a lot that could be said, but I'd like to think that through the struggle there might have also been an awakening around how differently we could live. There's certainly one of the things that did seem to come out significantly through the struggle was a greater sense of gratitude for small things.
I agree.
I'd like to think that perhaps, that greater appreciation for being outdoors might have engendered a greater appreciation for our environment and the issues concerning that.
I would like to think that too.
I don't know. Yeah. I just don't know. I drove out of Melbourne last night, and even though it was incredibly beautiful and joyous to see everyone out on those cafe tables on the street, there was a little part of me that wondered, have we learnt what we needed to learn from this experience?
Absolutely. Thank you. How do you think you'd feel if you were told that we're about to go into another lockdown, for example, next March, the oncoming autumn flu season, COVID season? How does that make you feel when I ask that question?
Oh, I think we'll all answer the same way and say that it was incredibly overwhelming, and there's a sense of immediate fatigue.
Yeah, that's a great description, immediate fatigue. Thank you. My final question for you today, Melinda, is, was there a particular image or dream that was reoccurring for you through this time? It could be even a particular song or album, a genre of music that you felt drawn to. Many people that I've spoken to had a reoccurring vision or a picture of themselves during the very long nights and days of stage 3 and 4 restrictions. I personally kept seeing a lioness trapped in a cage. It was a circus cage, and I had cubs jumping all over me, which really did reflect my small space that I existed in with my little children. Over that time, I was let out only to go sort of jumping through hoops and doing what I was told, and then put back into this cage and locked up again. And I would snarl at anyone that came near the cage. It was a really strong image for me that I kept seeing in my darker days during this lockdown. Do you have anything that what you were dreaming about, or perhaps a vision or an image that came to you, or even just a genre of music that you were particularly drawn to over this time?
What I noticed I was doing a lot was I was looking at small things a lot more. So I think often our camera roll in our phone is really reflective of the way that we were looking at the world during that time. And I took a lot of photos of nature. I particularly had this fascination I noticed with the sky. I was looking up at the sky a lot, and I think I was watching, the skies through autumn and winter in Melbourne and Victoria are particularly beautiful. And I think I was taking a lot of solace from the wide, free expanse above me in reflection to what was happening down here in this earthly plane. And I was really consciously trying to listen to music that was really uplifting and just helped me shift. I listened to a lot of podcasts during that time.
So did I.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, and I think my focus, as much as I possibly could, was on cultivating calm and being as grounded as I could. And some days I think I achieved that more than others. But certainly my relationship to nature and I had to, it felt like this absolute desperate need to have that connection to nature throughout that time. So I think that probably, it's not one symbol, but it certainly felt like I had a reoccurring relationship and a drawing, particularly to the sky and the open, wide sky. I'm very fortunate to live in a place with a lot of space and a lot of big, open, wide country skies, and I think they were an enormous comfort to me.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, thank you. That's very beautiful. And that does draw our interview to a close, Melinda. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for sharing your unique experience of this COVID year with us, and for the insights that you've offered today. Your contribution to the web of stories that are woven into this podcast, it's so much appreciated. So once again, I just want to say thanks for being so open and sharing what was really quite a difficult time for us all.
Thank you, Amanda, and all the very best for the podcast series. I'm looking forward to listening to other interviews and learning, and hopefully this process and this impulse that you're following helps to generate more compassion and connection for us all.
Thank you. You've been listening to Lockdown Stories from Inside. I hope you've enjoyed this interview and it's provided you with plenty of food for thought and the opportunity to expand your understanding of the breadth of human experience. Thank you for lending your ears as we walked a mile in someone else's shoes. See you next time.